So shall I perhaps make the introduction now, or shall we wait a few more minutes?
So we are 38 online. I don't know how many people we are expecting.
Yeah, I think a few more will join us, but I think we should stick to the time for the people that are here, right? So not make everyone wait, but. So let's make a start. So I would like to introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce Ryan Urbanowicz, who is giving the first keynote for DeclarativeAI this year. It is a joint keynote between RuleML NRR and DecisionCAMP. Ryan is assistant professor of informatics at the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine. He's the director of the URBS lab. I hope I pronounce this properly. His research focuses on the development of artificial intelligence, machine learning, data mining, and their application mostly, I believe, Ryan, to biomedical analysis in genomics, but also to other areas as well. So Ryan, I may say, is best known for his research in evolutionary algorithms and rule-based machine learning, which should be of interest to both communities, so to speak here, RuleML NRR and DecisionCAMP. He's particularly well known for his work in learning classifier systems, within which he's one of a handful, I would say, of international experts. I think you've won 4 Best Paper awards in recent years, Ryan, on that. And you've written the seminal textbook on this, published by Springer in 2017, with the title Introduction to Learning Classifier Systems. His lab has developed a number of open source software packages. I will just name a few. There's quite a lot, but a few that I find interesting and I think are pertinent to the research people do here. Rebate is one of them, which is a flexible suite of feature selection methods that account for complex associations in data sets. Extracts is another, which is more LCS-based, learning classifier systems based, and is designed to detect and model complex disease associations in noisy data. And more recently, AutoML Pipe, so an automated machine learning framework, which, as I understand it, performs rigorous machine learning and allows for unbiased analysis. So again, it's pioneering work in the realm of rigorous and interpretable machine learning using rules. So without further ado, I would like to thank Ryan for accepting the invitation and for being here with us this evening or this afternoon, whichever part of the world you are. So thank you for accepting the invitation to deliver the keynote today. As usual, please raise your hand for questions in the end of the presentation or type in the chat room, and myself or Jan will pick it up at the end. So without further ado, Ryan, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the really generous introduction. Again, my name is Ryan Urbanowicz. It's a pleasure to get to speak with you all today about an area that I've been really passionate about in research since grad school, which is rule-based machine learning. And this talk will have a particular focus on interpretability, which has become a really important aspect of machine learning. I mean, it's been important for many years, but even more so to date. Just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'll start just with a little bit of background on machine learning and what is interpretability in general, just to hopefully get everyone up on the same page. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own motivations in terms of the methods that I develop and apply, because my area of expertise for applying these methods is biomedical data analysis. So we'll talk about some of the common goals and challenges there that motivate a lot of our work, at least. Then I'm going to talk about rule-based machine learning in general. Some of you might not be terribly familiar with this area. In particular, a niche of rule-based machine learning learning methods referred to as learning classifier systems, which is what I've spent a lot of my research time on in particular. Then we're going to talk about interpretation strategies using these rule-based machine learners. So different ways that we think they are inherently interpretable and different ways we're trying to leverage them to extract even more information for other needs, particularly in the biomedical domain. So this will include just manual rule inspection, just interpreting the rules directly, which is pretty straightforward, but also looking at global rule patterns that emerge. So in these, as you'll see in a bit, these models, they model patterns in data by evolving an entire set of rules, and that entire set is the model itself. So how do we globally interpret what we find in a rule population? And then I'm going to talk lastly a bit about something we developed a few years back and we're continuing to focus on because we think it has a lot of potential and how it relates to other work in the LCS community, something called attribute tracking, which is another way to try and characterize patterns that are existing in the data. So we're interested not only in finding informative models, but how do we understand the underlying patterns that are being discovered? So just to start, what is machine learning? I like this definition from Samuel Arthur. It's a subset of artificial intelligence in the field of computer science that uses statistic techniques to give computers the ability to learn or progressively improve performance on a task with data without, of course, being explicitly programmed like you would in something like an expert system. The big picture goal in machine learning is to learn useful generalizations, right? So if we have this set of specific trees as a really rough example, we're trying to learn a generalization of what a tree is in general, so that in the future, when we see another specific tree, we can identify it. Very often we're trying to find patterns or associations so that we can make predictions on new data in the future. And of course, machine learning is a very general term. Some people might think immediately of deep learning when they hear machine learning, but of course, machine learning refers to a gigantic family of algorithms and methods that are available out there, each with their own specific tweaks and niches that you could explore infinitely. Another note that I think is a mistake that a lot of early investigators sometimes make, especially in my field, is that machine learning is not designed to demonstrate causality typically, right? It's all about finding associations, but just because something is associated, right, doesn't mean that it's the cause. And so this is, when I think of machine learning, the typical pipeline. You have some data, right? You have your machine learning algorithm that you're applying, and that algorithm is used to train a model, which is then used to make predictions. So just some perceptions of specific machine learners. We can see a bunch of them on here, like deep learning, extreme gradient boosting, decision trees. There's this perceived trade-off between the accuracy, the performance of how accurate the machine learning model can make predictions, and how interpretable it is. And I just want to note that this was, this figure was subjectively made, right? It's, this is not based on specific data coming from a specific data analysis. And there is this perception that the more sophisticated machine learner, the better job it's going to do in accuracy performance. And this can be the case, but of course, that's not always the case. For plenty of data sets, for plenty of analyses that have been conducted over the years, plenty of investigators have found that something as simple as logistic regression can work just as well in certain problems as deep learning. So that's important to keep in mind, at least initially here. So why do we care about interpretability? So often in many problem domains, making accurate predictions is not enough, right? And of course, this is application specific. Sometimes the only thing we care about is making an accurate prediction, but many other times it's really important to understand, how those predictions are being made. Of course, to foster trust. There might be cases where there needs to be some form of legal accountability, for instance, in medical practice or legal practice. And another important thing that we'll talk about a bit in a moment is identifying biases that might exist in our machine learning predictions. And those can be very hard to detect if we can't interpret, if we can't understand the predictions that are being made by our machine learner. Another important reason we care about interpretability, certainly in the biomedical field, is that we want to discover new knowledge. We want to understand what are the risk factors of disease, what are the patterns of association that lead to high or low risk. In other words, maybe there's some combination of genes that's really important. Maybe that combination is only important in some patients, but not others. So we want to be able to understand the underlying biology better. So just getting a prediction for machine is insufficient. And then there's also just the fact that interpretability typically pairs with model simplicity, right? So if you have a simpler model that has fewer features in it, variables in it, you might not need to collect as much data on subjects in the future to make predictions on them, which might lead to cost reductions, or it might lead to faster predictions being made in certain situations. So interpretability often pairs with simplicity, which has its own value. Just a quick, most of you've heard this term, black box machine learning at this point. Basically, it just refers to when you have a machine learning model that, it's typically very sophisticated. It might have a complex representation. And basically, it's a model. It finds, you have machine learning that can find patterns very well, but it can't really explain those patterns, certainly not in human comprehensible terms. And so when you hear black box modeling or black box machine learning, that's what it refers to. So there are consequences of using black box predictions, even when we think we only care about making accurate predictions. For example, there's this article talking about an inmate, Glenn Rodriguez, who was unfortunately denied parole by by a machine learning predictive algorithm generated by something called Compass. And basically, it indicated that he wasn't up for parole, and so he got more years on his sentence. But unfortunately, it turned out that this prediction was due to a typographical error in the original data set, which is very difficult to catch downstream if you aren't outputting some sort of interpretation of why this prediction that this particular parolee might commit a crime in the future or not. So that's one example. Another is in the field of medicine, and some of you might have heard of these articles coming out about there having been the potential for, or actually have been significant bias, racial bias, in the machine learning predictions of who's going to receive extra health care and who wouldn't. And again, a lot of this comes from the fact that if you don't understand the predictions that are being made downstream, it's a lot harder to catch either the inherent biases that were in the original data, or to catch just data entry errors that were made upstream, and so you don't see the result of that downstream when you just see a prediction, unless it's paired with some sort of explanation or interpretation of why a decision was made for a specific individual. Another thing I'd like to mention is this idea of interpretability versus explainability. And this is subtle. I actually only started thinking about this more specifically over the last year or two. When we talk about an interpretable machine learning method, kind of all that means is it's a model that's not a black box, right? A classic example would be a decision tree. It's very straightforward. You just follow your, I don't know how many of you are familiar with decision trees, but you just follow the predictions down the tree until you get to, you follow the data, the splits in the tree until you get to a prediction at the leaf nodes of the tree. And they're basically the hallmark of an explainable machine learner. Interpretable machine learner. An explainable machine learner starts with a black box and then tries to explain the predictions after the fact, like a post hoc analysis. So for instance, you could create another model, a local model that approximates the decision on an individual. You can compute derivatives from the original model to try and understand the predictions, or you can try and visualize part of the model input that the model is paying attention to while it's making its prediction. One pretty popular example of this is LIME, which stands for Local Interpretable Model Agnostic Explanations. And basically what LIME's doing is when you have an individual, let's say right here we have this big bright red plus sign. So this is an individual that we have making a prediction on, and we have this more sophisticated machine learner running in the background. And what it does is it tries to generate a local model to more easily explain what are the factors that led to the prediction of this being a plus sign rather than a circle in this case. However, there are those out there that I happen to agree with, like Cynthia Rudin, Dr. Cynthia Rudin, who published this article in May of 2019 entitled "Stop Explaining Black Box Machine Learning Models for High Stakes Decisions and Just Use Interpretable Models Instead." And basically, she points out that interpretability is not the same thing as explainable. They're not equivalent, not by a long shot. Ultimately, when you trust a black box to make predictions, you're really trusting the database that was built from, all the original training data and the data that was passed into the model to make a prediction. And that's really not something that you can rely on, right? There's lots of mistakes in training data and incoming data, typos, et cetera, right? Also, when you're making a local model to try and explain a more sophisticated model, you're actually relying on two models instead of just one, right? And necessarily these models will end up disagreeing with each other, right? Because if your explainable model always had the same explanation as your original model, or always made the same predictions as your original model, you could just throw out the more complex one and use the simple one. And then you'd have an interpretable machine learning model to begin with. So explainability, it's going to be inaccurate a lot of the time. So it's not really a solution in itself. And again, if you can explain, if you can produce and explain an interpretable model, why would you use a black box is sort of the point of that. So let me talk about some aspects of interpretability. In other words, what makes a model interpretable. So Rudin also says that this is, in this case, you'd have a model that obeys a domain-specific set of constraints. You also have just the representation that's being used, right? A decision tree, a tree format is much simpler to understand than a network of input and output values. The model size and complexity, right, in itself can make a model more or less interpretable. And whether your model is just a single model or an ensemble of models that come together to form sort of a meta model. And a simple example of that is a decision tree is a single model, a single tree. And a random forest is a whole collection of decision trees that collectively form an ensemble to make predictions using some kind of voting scheme. So in some ways, interpretability can be a subjective quality. And so that makes it sort of difficult to wrap your head around and distinguish from explainability. But for the most part, hopefully you get the gist. There are a few modes of interpretability that I think about. I think that are pretty commonly thought about when it comes to trying to interpret machine learning models. The first and simplest, I think, is identifying relevant features and quantifying the importance of features in your data set. So, you know, there's aspects of feature selection here and ranking what features contribute most, are most important to making accurate predictions and understanding that. Another that I focus on a lot, and you'll see is a common theme in this talk, is trying to characterize what are the patterns between the features in the data set. Like, are they simple univariate relationships with our target outcome that we're trying to predict? Or are they more complex multivariate relationships, either additive, maybe there are interactions, which I'll talk about more in a second, or heterogeneous associations, which again, I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. Also, can individual predictions from a machine learner be described in human comprehensible terms? In other words, can we say, okay, we decided you're high risk because this feature had this, was in this value range, and so on and so forth. And that sort of lines up nicely with rules, right? So at the end of the day, can a model as a whole be described as a set of conditional rule expressions? Because I think, you know, it's inherently, you know, the most human relatable way to understand a model is through if-then statements. So let me move away briefly just to my domain of biomedical or clinical data analysis and talk about some of the common goals that we have when applying or in biomedical research. So first off, we want to identify risk factors and biomarkers of health outcomes. We want to identify drug targets. We want to better target preventative medicine, and we want to understand the underlying causes of disease. We also want to develop predictive models for deployment. So maybe in the clinic, we want to, you know, identify what patients are at highest risk of readmission after a certain number of months after being treated for cancer, or something along those lines. We also want to improve clinical efficiency, right? We want to improve the speed and accuracy of the diagnoses as well as treatments. And of course, we want to reduce costs wherever possible as well. So biomedical data analysis is one of the things that drew me to it. In many ways, it's almost like a worst case scenario. It's messy, it's big data, it's, you know, there's tons of different sources of data to draw from. So for instance, omics data, there are many biomedical sources like the genome, transcriptome, proteome, et cetera. So the data itself, you know, can be very big. There can be, you know, hundreds of thousands to millions of variables that we might want to dig through. And often, you know, to collect subjects or to gather data on subjects is expensive, so we don't always have the largest sample size. We also are trying to integrate different data sources, right? We might grab data across these different omics and integrate it with just patient records, patient history, demographics, et cetera. These data sets are often riddled with missing values. You can have, you know, dramatic class imbalances if you're trying to do classification problems to discriminate between sick and healthy, for example. And of course, you can have bias in the data itself, let alone in the machine learning models that we might be generating. And then in biomedical data, often the data can be structured or unstructured. So unstructured might be something like doctor's notes. And so how do we use that data? And that's where the field of natural language processing might come into play. The associations in biomedical data, are often very noisy. I started my computer science work looking at learning classifier systems in a field that primarily focused on fairly clean problems. In disease research, they're extraordinarily noisy. The signal is often very subtle and very complex. And the relationships between the variables and the outcome we're trying to understand is often very complex as well. And also in the field of medicine, there's a demand to have confidence in and understanding of the results. So these results need to be reproducible and, of course, interpretable, as we've already discussed. Now, notably, when we care about detecting complex associations, this can be at odds with training an interpretable model, right? Because in order to find these complex multivariate patterns in data, we often need to rely on more and more sophisticated machine learning methods to suss out those complexities. And as we've already discussed, there can be a trade-off there. And that's something we try and tackle in our own work. So just give you an idea of how these associations, how complex they can be. Usually when I'm handed a data set from collaborators, studying all sorts of biomedical outcomes of interest, we have this gigantic pool of potentially predictive variables that we start with. And so we're usually starting with some sort of feature selection task to try and narrow it down. So a lot of machine learners just can't chew on millions and millions of variables. But then we have to deal also with the fact that there might be complex patterns in this data. And so what might those look like? So here on the left, we have different kinds of variables that might be in our data set: genetic, environmental, epigenetic. And there are different ways that these can relate to our disease phenotypes. Simple univariate, you can have one variable influence multiple disease outcomes or different parts of a disease phenotype. Like in autism, you have different characteristics that you would observe in autistic patients that might be influenced differently. Epistasis, where you can have multiple variables that are interacting with one another, almost hiding the effect of each other at the same time in their association with outcome. And then another one that I focus a lot on is heterogeneity, where you can have different factors that contribute to the same or similar phenotypic outcome in different subsets of patients. And this is a really tricky problem when you don't know what those subgroups are ahead of time. And we'll talk about this again a little bit more in a minute. A little bit more on epistasis or feature interactions. Whenever you go from just looking at one feature versus one outcome and trying to look for a relationship between that, and then scaling it up to looking for interactions, you have this cursive dimensionality problem, right? Your search space just blows up exponentially very, very quickly. And so that's a problem in itself. So often it's not practical to look for every possible combination one at a time. And so just to kind of highlight the particular challenge of epistasis that I'm interested in, imagine we have two variables, 1 and 2. So here we have A and B is one variable, and then the colors black and red are the other. And let's say that these two variables have an additive relationship with the phenotypic outcome. So we can see that as you have, variable 1 is A or variable 2 is A, and we go to B, both of them have an increase in the phenotypic outcome, but they add on top of one another, right? There's this individual signal within each, but together it's even stronger. An exaggerated version of this is a multiplicative interaction, right? Where now having both of those features have a specific value, you see an exaggerated effect than just the sum of the two parts. But univariate simple methods can still detect this. And then we have what I would call masked or crossover interactions, right? And so here, this is where one variable can actually hide the effect of the other. And so these are the most difficult to detect because univariate approaches have a strong chance of totally missing them. So if you're starting with this giant set of features in biomedical data and you're trying to look for potentially complex patterns, and you filter out any variable that doesn't have a strong univariate or even a reasonably strong univariate effect on its own, then you could miss a whole lot of really interesting complex patterns downstream when you go to apply sophisticated machine learners. Another quick word on heterogeneity. So I mentioned this is where you have features that are predictive in different subgroups of patients in your data set. And ideally, we would know what these subgroups are ahead of time, but it turns out it doesn't work that way. There's so much heterogeneity, not just in the causes of disease, but in how diseases present themselves in patients, that it's really, you don't have enough information trying to cluster patients ahead of time and then look for features that are predictive in each group after the fact. So here in heterogeneity, you can have unknown subgroups of patients that have totally different genetic or environmental or other factors that contribute to the occurrence of disease in that particular patient. And so this is a real confounding problem for a lot of machine learners. And this is important to personalized medicine, right? Where, ideally, if we better understand what subgroup you fall into as a patient, we might better understand what drugs you'll respond to better, or the fact that it's more important to target you for preventative care earlier. I'm going to skip this slide, just talks a little bit more about how heterogeneity has been dealt with in the past. But I'll just say in a nutshell, previously they've tried to cluster patients ahead of time and then look for best models within each cluster. But there's a lot of assumptions that are being made behind the scenes that lead to this not being terribly effective. So those biological problems are what led me to rule-based machine learning to begin with. So in a big picture, this is a general paradigm of piecewise machine learning. And I'll talk about what that means here in a second, but basically it's rule-based first off, where the solution, model, or output is collectively comprised of individual rules, typically of the simple if-then form, right? So if something is red and it's an octagon, then it's a stop sign might be the predicted classification. And so there are a lot of methods that could fall under the category of rule-based machine learning, including association rule mining, which is used, for instance, to decide what products are purchased together frequently in a grocery store. Or artificial immune systems is another example, which is a method that's often used to detect self from non-self in sort of extreme classification problems. So maybe for detecting emails that are spam or something like that. Or viruses, I should say. And then there are learning classifier systems, which I'm going to talk about more today. And there are two main genres of learning classifier systems, Michigan and Pittsburgh style. For simplicity today, I'm just going to talk about Michigan style. You don't have to worry about the differences right now, but just so you're aware, there are a couple main genres of these methods. And before diving into LCSs more, let me just step back and talk about rules again, this time in the context of decision trees. So if you're familiar with decision trees, right, you basically have a tree of features and you're asking, is the feature value, above or below some threshold or have one value or not? So here, our decision tree asks, is it raining? And yes or no. And then we just follow down the tree until we hit a decision at the end node of each branch of the tree. So here, is it raining? No, don't bring in anything is the decision. Is it raining and is it windy? If it's raining and not windy, then you might just bring an umbrella. So what's nice about a decision tree, and the reason it's so interpretable, arguably is because you can break it down into a set of rules, right? So every path down the tree to an outcome node or a leaf node is in itself a rule, right? So where a rule, as I'm sure you all know, you have if some conditions separated by ands and sometimes ors, then some outcome prediction. Oops. And so here we have examples of rules that can be linearized from this decision tree. And there are also parallels between rule-based machine learning and rule-based expert systems, which I'm sure many more of you are much more familiar with. Certainly, without getting into too much detail on expert systems, I think there's certainly a lot of potential for downstream marriages of machine learning and expert systems in the future, although I realize this is a very complex task in itself. Okay, so back to learning classifier systems. So as I mentioned, they're rule-based machine learners, and they have the intuition and interpretability of a rule-based system, which is ultimately the fundamental pieces of the model are simple human comprehensible rules. It also has the data-driven improvement of performance that comes from a machine learning algorithm. And it also draws from evolutionary algorithms to make discoveries of new rules. So the discovery component of the modeling algorithm is using an evolutionary algorithm. And so John Holland is the father of both evolutionary algorithms and learning classifier systems. And traditionally, learning classifier systems have been primarily focused on classification tasks. And they do this piecewise learning that I alluded to before. And notably, this piecewise learning is really ideal to detecting heterogeneous associations I was talking about before, where in different subjects of patients, there might be different factors that are predictive of their disease outcome. And so by learning in a piecewise manner, we can directly learn parts of a model that are important to this group of people versus that group of people, which is a really exciting possibility. And the reason I started paying attention to these methods to begin with. And also they just provide a different perspective than most machine learning algorithms do of the data. So arguably, even if they don't always work best, like you can't rely on any machine learner to work best in any situation, I would argue that they are a very valuable asset in any machine learning toolkit. And so down here at the bottom, you can see a simple example of what a learning classifier system might learn in terms of a model to make predictions in this case, it was applied to a sleep apnea study, trying to predict who is a case who has sleep apnea from who is a control, who doesn't. So you might have, if this genetic variable has this value and the body mass index is less than 20, then we predict they're healthy, and so on and so forth. And so this set of rules, each rule is conditionally tied to a subset of patients that match its conditions. Okay. So one thing I like about rule-based machine learning and learning classifier systems, it's kind of changing the paradigm of machine learning modeling as most machine learning researchers know it. So most machine learners, you have your data set and you generate a model that tries to cover the entire problem space, right? So all your data points would come in, any new data points in the future would come into the model, and a prediction would come out for any of them. And the entire model covers any input data points. Differently, a rule-based machine learning model, like a learning classifier system, it finds these rules represented by these different colored boxes that cover different parts of the problem space. And so they're only activated, they only are relevant when an input data point matches that part of the model. And then just those relevant rules are triggered and participate in making a prediction about that incoming individual. And so this allows you to capture more complex heterogeneous problems very nicely, and at the same time provides a more interpretable path. Just another illustration of what I mean by piecewise learning. So here, if we have this mathematical function in space, you can imagine we would try and approximate it in a piecewise manner with individual line segments. So that's effectively what a learning classifier system is trying to do, is trying to cover the problem space in segments. So here we have a function approximation problem where we're trying to approximate this function using a bunch of rules in a learning classifier system. And this was a visualization that was generated to try and show how rules are covering different parts of this problem. And just another illustration, many of you have probably seen this if you've looked up, just basics of machine learning. But basically here we have a classification problem where we have blue and red circles and sort of a yin-yang shape. And we're showing how different machine learners like support vector machine, naive Bayes, random forest are trying to separate out a decision boundary to best classify red from blue circles. And we can see how each algorithm is kind of doing this based on the overall model. And just to illustrate how a learning classifier system is trying to do this in this context, every one of these boxes that appears is a rule that's being discovered. In this case, they're hyperrectangles just for the sake of this illustration, but they don't have to be hyperrectangles. They could be hyperellipsoids or something else. And basically, it conducts this piecewise learning by having rules that capture just parts of the problem space individually. Some can be overlapping, some don't need to be. Okay, and just a little bit more background on LCS, since I imagine it's probably new to a lot of this audience. The different approaches for learning classifier system methods are typically categorized by the type of learning and the nature of the endpoint predictions being made. So a lot of my work is focused on supervised learning, where we have labeled data to train off of. And so we're doing basic classification tasks where we're trying to find a decision boundary between cases and controls or multiple classes in a problem space. Or if we have a continuous valued outcome, we might want to do something like regression or function approximation, which learning classifier systems have also been applied to, but notably they're really mainly designed for classification tasks most effectively. And the interpretability of these methods is again kind of focused on classification tasks. Things get messier when you are trying to do regression or function approximation. But originally, learning classifier systems were actually developed for reinforcement learning problems. That was their starting point, was to try and model behavioral policies for things like maze navigation and so on and so forth. So a lot of the early work in these methods is actually in this field. I mentioned before that evolutionary algorithms are sort of driving rule discovery in these approaches. And I've always been fascinated by computer science methods that are inspired by nature and nature-inspired computing, basically. I've always loved that idea. I started as a bioengineer, and I think that's probably the main reason I got so obsessed with evolutionary algorithms over the years. But basically, an EA, or an evolutionary algorithm, adopts this neo-Darwinian set of principles of biological evolution. So within the computer, you're conducting reproduction, mutation, recombination, selection of more fit parents to create new, better, hopefully more fit offspring. And these methods are basically trial and error methods. And they attempt to globally optimize some metric. In this case, we're trying to optimize our prediction accuracy. And they have this stochastic component to how they evolve, which makes them very flexible in their ability to avoid making assumptions about a problem space and discover really complex patterns in data. And another thing to note is that evolutionary algorithms apply a population-based search. So you have a whole population of solutions that are being evolved rather than just exploring the search space with a single individual. Okay, here's a schematic of a learning classifier system. And I'm not going to explain all the nuances of these methods today. I will point you to a video that you can watch if you're interested in learning more. But at a high level, let me just walk you through how these generally work. So you have your environment, which is, in this case, let's say our training data set. And so we take a single data point from our data set. And this is sort of unique to learning classifier systems. They learn on one data point at a time. And we take our population of rules that exist currently. You can imagine we actually typically start with an empty population. And then we say, well, what rules match, the conditions of what rules match this input data point? And that forms a match set. So these are now all the rules that are relevantly matching the conditions of, or the condition values of the input data point. So now we have our match set. And because we're doing supervised learning, we now say, okay, of these matching rules, which one had the correct prediction? That's our correct set, and which ones had the incorrect prediction. And then once we've separated these out, we can update a set of rule parameters that basically track how useful or how valuable these rules are. And it's typically tied to the accuracy of a rule. So of the individuals in the data set that this rule matches, how accurately does it predict the correct outcome? And then we have this cycle of rule discovery where we pick the best, we probabilistically pick the best parents from the population. We generate some new offspring using evolutionary algorithm operators. And then we add those new offspring back into the population. The idea being that any useful building blocks in parents that we've found so far will help us to discover better and better rules throughout this evolutionary process. And again, I'm not going to get into all the details, but I just want to give you a sense of how these work. And then after you're done training this population of rules, after it's allowed to train for some amount of time and optimize rules to the target problem, you can also apply some kind of rule compaction to remove irrelevant rules or new rules that didn't get a chance to be properly evaluated, or just to reduce the redundancy in rules that you've discovered so far in the population. And this also helps towards interpretability. Rules are typically represented pretty simply. You see these hashtags here, they represent wildcards. So basically they say we don't care. So if every one of these boxes is a feature in your data set, in this case, we're looking at genetic variables that can have a value of 0, 1, or 2. So you can see in this rule, it says, well, if this genetic variable has a value of 2, and this one has a value of 0, and so on and so forth, where we don't care what these wildcard values are, then this rule predicts that you're going to be sick, you're going to have the disease. This is sort of the classic way that learning classifier systems represent rules. But you can, have a much more flexible representation like this one, where now instead of including every feature in your data set, you just include a reference to what feature is being specified in the rule versus ignored. And then you indicate its value or value range if we're dealing with a quantitative feature rather than a categorical feature. And you can also have text values that are accepted in this. So you can have a very flexible representation to handle different kinds of problems, which is really nice. Just as an illustration of how learning classifier systems match incoming data points. So here we have, let's say, an existing current population of rules that have been discovered so far by our learning classifier system, where every number or hashtag is a feature. It represents a feature in your data set. So this data set is very simple. It just has 5 features in it, let's say. And then we have the outcome prediction for each. So our new instance from the training set looks like this. It has these values for the 5 features. And so all the rules that match it now get lit up and form the match set. So these all match, the conditions here all match this data point. And then we further create our correct set. And so these are the ones that not only match, but also assert a correct prediction. And so this, just to give you an idea what's going on behind the scenes as these learn. So if you want to learn more about learning classifier systems, we have this nice little YouTube animated video called Learning Classifier Systems in a Nutshell that hopefully very clearly explains the basics of these methods if you're intrigued and want to learn a little bit more. And there's also a textbook that myself and co-author Will Brown from the University of Wellington wrote back in 2017 that also provides the basics if you're interested. Okay. Now I just want to dive into interpretation in learning classifier systems and some of the work myself and colleagues have conducted to try and make the most of this very promising machine learning strategy and in fields where we care about interpretability. Pretty early on, my colleague John Holmes had published some early work on a learning classifier system he developed that was focused on epidemiological surveillance. So at the end of the day, they were trying to create really simple, human interpretable rules that could be used in epidemiology to explain, how predictions on different diseases were being made. So we had, for example, breast cancer, echocardiogram, heart disease, hepatitis. So these are some example rules that were coming out of applying their rule-based machine learner to these different biomedical domains. And what was really nice and a huge selling point for these methods is that they could not only achieve, comparable or sometimes better predictive performance, but the models themselves were comprised of these very intuitive rules. And at the end of the day, this is the starting point for interpretability in rule-based machine learning, is that you get, the model can be broken down into simple if-then expressions that you can hand to a clinician or hand to whoever the domain expert is, and they can at least agree or disagree with how the machine is making its prediction. And that fosters trust and their usability in general. Over here on the right is a figure I made a while back to sort of illustrate how learning classifier systems are able to detect complex interactions in data. I mentioned epistasis, or feature interactions, was one of the challenges we were really interested in. And so in this case, what you're looking at is a penetrance function, a penetrance table, where we have 2 genetic variables on either axes. These are the 3 possible values for the SNPs, in this case, single nucleotide polymorphisms. So this is, you might remember from high school genetics, like big A, big A, big A, little a, little a, little a. That's what the 0, 1, 2 encoding represents. But you might have a particular combination of genetic values that is high risk. These values indicate the probability that you're going to be sick if you have that genetic combination. So in this case, we have in the real data that we've either gathered, or in this case, we simulated this data to have a strong pattern between these 2 variables, a strong interaction. So here we have this particular genotype combination that is strongly high risk. And here's what it would look like as a data point. So here's an individual's values across, in this case, I think there's 20 SNPs. And here's the interaction between SNPs 2 and 3 that we care about with a value of 2 and 0. That's our high risk value. So this is an individual that has that high risk value. They do indeed have the disease. And so ideally what we want is our rule-based machine learner to find a rule like this, right? Where we don't care what the rest of these values are, but we do care that we found this specific genetic combination. So this rule basically says if SNP3 has a value of 2 and SNP4 has a value of 0, then predict high risk or that the patient has disease. So all that to just sort of point out that these rule-based methods very nicely can detect very complex interactions of simple scale, or they can be 3, 4, 5-way interactions between variables. So it makes them very powerful and flexible to detect complex patterns. just growing off of John Holmes' work in 2007, they made this nice visualization to not only provide the rule in sort of text format like you're seeing here, but also to provide a nice visualization to help further explain, what are the features that are included in the rules and what is the value range of that rule when predicting high or low risk. So there was some early work, which is really nice, but unfortunately hasn't been expanded upon yet, to basically, take the output of a rule-based machine learner and make it, easily interpretable for someone who is not a machine learning expert. And this is something that we revisit all the time. This basic topic of how do you take the output of any machine learner, let alone a rule-based machine one, and make it interpretable to a non-expert. And so this area is still ripe for further development. Here is an illustration of what you might get out of a learning classifier system after you train it. This is the population of rules, or an illustration of some of the rules you get after training it. So here we see rules are specified here by, these are the indexes to features and the values of the features at those indexes. So this is the condition of the rule together. We have the action of the rule, or the class that's being predicted. Here it's labeled phenotype. And then we have the fitness, because it's an evolutionary algorithm where the fitness is a function of accuracy. And then the accuracy is how accurate is this rule in terms of making predictions in the patients, in the subjects that it covers, that it matches, which is an important distinction from most other modeling methods. Because normally when you see accuracy in modeling, you're saying how well does the model perform on the data set as a whole. This is just giving you the accuracy of how well a rule makes accurate predictions just on those instances that it also matches, that subgroup of instances that it also matches. But at the end of the day, what you get out of a machine learner, out of a rule-based machine learner, might be a very long list of rules. And so as much as I'd like to say that rule-based machine learning is just the solution and everyone should be using them, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of making them extremely user-friendly. And one of the problems is that you can get a large list of rules as an output. And how do you deal with that? So here are some of the challenges of learning classifier system interpretation at the rule population level. So first off, how do we identify optimal rules, particularly in noisy domains? How do we sort rules in that population list I just showed you to facilitate manual rule inspection? Because there's no real universal metric to say this rule is better than another, unfortunately. Although there have been many good strategies that have been proposed that are continuing to be built off of. Rule compaction continues to be a non-obvious problem with a not obvious solution, because the best way to conduct rule compaction varies as you go from problem to problem. And then global interpretation, right? How do we extract patterns from the whole set of rules that you've evolved at once? And a lot of my work is also focused on that question. I'll just mention really quickly, we've done some early work on rule compaction. As I said, there is no simple solution, but it's important to note that as you go from cleaner to noisier problems, like in the biomedical domain, a lot of the methods you'll find out there that have been proposed in rule-based machine learning communities, they just don't work, and they're not reliable as you deal with a domain that's extremely noisy. So one of the things we've been trying to do is figure out better ways to handle rule compaction in extremely noisy domains and do it in an efficient way. I'm not going to get into more detail on this today, but I just wanted to note that. Getting into this idea of globally interpreting a population of rules as a model, we were trying to deal early on with some basic problems of going beyond manual rule inspection. So let me just to illustrate some of these problems, we had simulated a data set that had both interactions and heterogeneity. So specifically, half of our data set had a two-way interaction, pure two-way interaction between two variables, and the other half had a separate two-way interaction. So this two-way interaction didn't matter at all in these people, and in these people, this interaction didn't matter at all. So we're creating a pretty complex data set. And what we found, when we trained our rule population is that, more often than not, we found that it was finding rules that specified just one pair. So here's x2, x3 is yellow, and x0, x1 is green. And so it was finding these pairs very nicely, very, very often in rules. However, there's a lot of opportunity for overfitting because it's a very noisy problem. So when it comes to manual rule inspection, if you just look at this one rule, it wouldn't be easy to tell that these are the two important variables that are involved in an interaction. You might think it's a four-way interaction between these or something else. So it's not so straightforward always when you're trying to do manual rule inspection in complex, noisy problem domains. So we tried to step back from this. One of the earliest things we did was just come up with a way to estimate what features were actually important across rules of the population. And this is a very simple approach. But basically, here we have 4 simple rules in these rows. So rule 1 says if x2 has a value of 2 and x4 has a value of 1, then predict 0, healthy. I won't talk about these other parameters for now. And then I will say numerosity is the number of virtual copies of a rule that's saved in the population. So as training occurs, if it finds that rule again, instead of re-adding it to the population, just up increments numerosity. And it also kind of serves as a protective strength of a rule. Like if a rule is rediscovered again and again, it's probably a better rule. But anyway, what we do is we look at how often rules are specified. I'm sorry, features. So these X's are specified in rules, and I put X's over them here. And then we count their numerosities. And the basic idea is to get a sense of what features are, occur in rules again and again and again. Which ones are more important to making valuable predictions about our patients. And so we came up with a couple of ways to basically evaluate feature importance in across an LCS rule population. We published this paper back in 2012, where we actually expand upon this, deriving statistical strategies and visualization strategies to further globally interpret a learning classifier system population. And again, we have the same model, and I'll just point out very quickly for time that using permutation-based approaches, you can very nicely show that you can identify what features are overrepresented in your rule population beyond chance, even when you have very noisy patterns in your data set. And further, you can look at co-occurrences of features within rules. So across your rule population, you can say what pairs of features co-occur, and that can help you identify potential interactions as well. So in this case, we were able to find at the top of our list, x0, x1, and x2, x3 popped up to the top of the list as you would expect. So this gave us a reliable pathway to start applying learning classifier systems and extracting what features were most important and what potential interactions existed in data by looking at the rule population as a whole, rather than focusing on individual rules like you ideally want to if the patterns in the data were cleaner rather than noisier. We also looked at ways to visualize the rule population through clustered heat maps, as well as networks. And networks turned out to be a really informative approach. So here we created a network where the size of a node is how often that feature was specified in rules across the population. And the connections between nodes were how often those features co-occurred together in rules. And so as you just filter down the weights, what was very nice to see in this case, where we had this heterogeneous epistatic interaction that was modeled, is that you could very nicely recapitulate the epistatic interactions, but that were important to subsets of patients in the data set. And so this is something that others in the field of learning classifier system research have expanded upon, including work by Jean-May Bacardit and his learning classifier system BioHeal, and they looked at interaction networks and did something very similar and created some really nice visualizations, again, to facilitate the interpretation of rules as in terms of a rule set rather than relying on looking at individual rules, which again could be problematic in noisy problem spaces. I'm going to skip through just for time. I realize I'm already going a little later, but there have been a number of other nice visualizations that have been proposed out there, again, to facilitate the identification of global patterns across rules. This is work by Liu, Brown, and Zhu in 2018 and 2019. We'd also done some work to basically ask, well, in noisy problems, we don't always want to just focus on accuracy, right? We want there to be a balance between accuracy and rule coverage. This was a way to kind of get at, the ideal rules that we discover aren't always 100% accurate because they're going to be overfit most of the time, which is a common problem in machine learning. So just to kind of skip to the punchline here, what we did was we created our own adaptive fitness function using a Pareto Front for inspiration. And a Pareto Front basically is a way to have multiple objectives. It's multi-objective optimization, and to when you're doing when you're training a population of solutions, you're evaluating them using both objectives and identifying this non-dominated front. These are sort of the best in at least one objective. And then you're picking from this front to select parents to generate a new population next, right? So how do we choose our best individuals that can either be just good in one objective, just good in the other, or some balance between the two? And we use this as inspiration to evaluate rules in sort of an adaptable way, where during the course of learning classifier rule discovery, we updated this front to say, well, what was the best rule we found so far as it existed on this front? And then any rules that were discovered in the future, their fitness was determined relative to its distance from this front. And so what it gave us was evolving fitness landscapes that allowed us to much more flexibly adapt our learning classifier system rule discovery to noisy problems. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. And I'll say one last thing. I wanted to get into attribute tracking, which I mentioned is the last thing I wanted to talk about today. One of the big problems we've dealt with in our lab is trying to characterize heterogeneous subgroups, as I've mentioned before. And I said that rule-based methods are really good at this intuitively. And so we had developed this idea called attribute tracking. And it's sort of separate information that's stored about the model over the course of learning. And you can think of it sort of like ant pheromone paths that, as ants explore a space looking for food, they lay down some pheromone and then some more ants will go in that path again and again. And so basically what's happening here is during the course of rule learning, we look at the correct sets that get formed along the way. And remember that every cycle of learning classifier system learning is focused on one training instance. So we say for that one training instance, we look at its correct set and we say what features were most important for making predictions about that individual. And we track that information over time and then we can visualize it. So this heat map here, we have every column is a person in the data set, every row is a feature in the data set. And we get this signature for every person in the data set as to what variables, what features in the data were most important for making accurate predictions about them as an individual. And so when we cluster, this allows us to find data-driven or feature-driven heterogeneous subgroups that exist in the data set. So rather than relying on making assumptions about what are the patient subgroups ahead of time and then doing modeling, the learning classifier system framework can actually let us find these heterogeneous groups directly. And then we can use attribute tracking to sort of reverse engineer what those subgroups are and then evaluate them further. So specifically, we applied this to a study of bladder cancer a number of years ago. And we found two major subgroups emerge. One that was primarily, the risk factors were primarily focused on pack years of smoking. And the other subgroup had these two DNA repair SNPs that were really important. And then we compared these discovered subgroups from the attribute tracking. We compared the survivorship between these groups and found there was a significant difference in their survivorship, suggesting that these were indeed clinically relevant subgroups of patients that were discovered using this attribute tracking approach. I'm just going to skip over the end just to say that we have a number of pieces of software that are available out there. If you're interested in learning classifier systems, we've made some scikit-learn compatible versions for people to be able to use and apply more easily, or as a nice starting place if you have some ideas of where you think rule-based machine learning might be able to go in the future. We've also been working on expanding this attribute tracking pipeline. We have something called LCS Dive now that we just submitted for publication. And the idea is to automate this process of discovering the heterogeneous clusters and identifying what statistically significant clusters are so we can follow up on them for further study. Again, I'll save that details for that if there are any questions, but I want to allow time for questions. We also have a machine learning pipeline that we have just submitted for publication as well. There's an automated machine learning pipeline. And the idea is to have a framework where you can compare your typical machine learning methods that most people are familiar with and comfortable with, and be able to compare these to rule-based machine learners, including Extracts, which is our own learning classifier system that we've developed, as well as some other really common established rule-based machine learners in the field, including XCS and ELCS. But again, if you're interested in this, I'm glad to talk offline. So I want to end by just saying some advantages of LCS and opportunities. They really, I believe in these methods as having a lot of potential because of the fact that they can model complex patterns and have this inherent advantage of actual and potential interpretability. Rules at the end of the day are the basic unit of these models. They make limited assumptions about the problem space that allows them to detect complex patterns. We can not only detect, but characterize complex patterns in this data, which has been really important in my domain, where we're interested in identifying what epistatic interactions exist between what variables in the data set and what features are important in one subgroup versus another of our patients. And these methods are adaptable to many problem domains. They've been used widely outside of biomedical research. That just happens to be my area of expertise. There are available implementations that you can use now, as I mentioned, but there are plenty of challenges that remain too. This field is, I think, wide open for further advancement, and I hope some of you will take the time to learn more and maybe get involved in some either rule-based machine learning or learning classifier system research. And with that, I'm going to stop. And I'm going to take any questions. Thank you all for your time and your patience. And I hope you found this talk interesting. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Ryan. We would give you the virtual clap now if we were all there in person. That was a very interesting, very informative talk. A lot of issues you touched upon. I wish we would have another half an hour of this personally. But without delaying any further, I'll pass on to the audience for any questions, please. Jakob has his hand up, I think. Oh, was it a clap, Jakob?
Actually, it's just message for Ryan. Probably he would answer.
Right.
later.
Yes, you have something in the chat, so
Yeah.
you read it out, Jakob.
But
yeah.
I do have a question, Ryan. In DecisionCAMP world or in decision management community in general, we use integrated machine learning and rule engine tools. And it's in very practical environments. Usually, it's used to discover rules in historical data and using supervised machine learning. And so it's like you mentioned already, it's very important that discovered rules should be from one side machine executable and from another side human readable, because humans can adjust this, adding their understanding of business context. And from this perspective, we tried many machine learning algorithms. Thanks God, so many of them available just for free, and they're very powerful. And me and my colleagues usually, when we discuss what algorithm works better, we always comes to two algorithms. It's a Reaper that generates the most compact rule sets and the most understandable, and this, of course, Decision Tree C4.5 algorithms. Usually, it's much larger rule sets. And and more difficult to interpret, but it produces good accuracy usually. So, what is your experience? What algorithm do you recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I fear that my answer is going to be very disappointing to you, which is that at the end of the day, it's very domain specific. It's very application specific. So if something's working for you, stick with it. I'm not trying to sell people. If you have a machine learning algorithm that's giving you what you need, in terms of interpretable, effective, rules or models, that's great. As you go from one domain to another, as you go from huge feature spaces to small one, or large training instance spaces to small ones, and all these other little complex nuances, I found that it's often very unpredictable what machine learning will work better or worse. There are basic guidelines. My initial go-tos, things that I always kind of rely on as a good, state of comparison would be something like a random forest or extreme gradient boosting. Those decision tree based ensemble approaches are very powerful. They do have limitations though. We actually showed that a lot of tree based methods, specifically decision trees, alone, or a random forest, they really start to fail to detect complex interactions after you have a certain sized feature space. And I'm talking like, 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 variables, something in there, somewhere in that range, they will stop being able to detect interactions. Now, extreme gradient boosting, some of those more sophisticated tree-based approaches, they don't always fail. Like the fact that they're learning on the residuals, the errors that are made in the previous generation of trees, something about that can allow them to still detect the interactions, but of course they are much less interpretable. I mean, even a random forest is not interpretable, really, right? Because you're trying to integrate all of these tree decisions that are coming from a population of trees. And so how do you parse that out in a clear way, how that prediction is being made, other than with an explainable approach, rather than just the model being interpretable? Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other question for Ryan? Yes, Emmanuel.
Yes, extremely nice talk, extremely interesting, and somebody wrote in the comments, inspiring. Could you say a bit about how your methods work on graph structured data, and what are the specifics? So how is everything that you presented similar when you do it on graphs? What are some specialities there?
So I'm not entirely sure what you mean by graph structured data. I'm typically what we're applying to is just tabular data, right? So when you're saying graph structured data, could you clarify?
Yeah, so either it's tabular data that has a lot of graph connections. For example, say in the medical world, it could be let me do something for the financial world. If one company owns another company and that company owns the next company, it is in some way tabular data, but it has these deep graph connections that you sometimes see in data sets. And I was wondering whether there are, and I imagine in the medical domain, this is also sometimes the case. And I was wondering whether you had any experiences in this setting.
Yeah, I haven't personally worked with graph data directly within, the rule-based machine learner. We often, we'll integrate data types into the same tabular set. So the idea being that if there are connections or interactions between variables of different types, that we're hoping to discover those through the machine learning directly. One thing we've done though, I mentioned briefly, we have our own learning classifier system called Extracts. And one of the things we're trying to do is how do we incorporate domain knowledge to accelerate the learning of the evolutionary algorithm to discover rules more quickly. And so if you have that network information ahead of time, you can use that to up or down weight your variable space so that it better drives the evolutionary algorithm. The way we've used this approach so far is we run feature importance estimators that are sensitive to interactions ahead of time. And then we use those weights to initialize, to basically guide the evolutionary algorithm. And we do it stochastically. So like sometimes it applies the weight, sometimes it doesn't, because you can apply bad weights and then you push the algorithm in the wrong direction. You don't want that either, right? So I believe you could, in a very similar way, take that network data and basically integrate it as expert knowledge to guide a rule-based machine learner towards specific combinations that are more likely to be informative. So as it's building the rule-based model, you have a better chance of success faster.
Thank you very much. And I find your combination of evolutionary algorithms and rules and learning fascinating. So it's really exciting to watch that. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
It's really fun stuff. I highly recommend any of you check it out. It's fun to play with at the very least. But yeah, I've also found it to be very useful.
Yeah. Plus one from me that I have looked into this kind of machine learning. But there is a raised hand by Bob. Bob, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I was really just interested, Ryan, in if you had any particular feelings about how the machine algorithms that you're using compare with the way that human beings do things. I mean, one of the things that struck me immediately when you were talking about the behavior of random forests was the way that people's brains work is obviously that we have lots of things processing in parallel. And certainly there are some ideas in terms of the way that consciousness works is that there are actually kind of voting procedures going on inside our head. So I think it was just, I just don't know whether you feel that particularly working in the sort of biomedical kind of applications, whether you have any kind of feeling about whether machine learning algorithms are really doing better than the medical consultants and so on.
I think there's always the opportunity. There's no guarantees, right? So, just because somebody trained a machine learning algorithm doesn't mean it's doing better, right? It takes a lot of comparison and evaluations to actually figure that out. And that's why that's one of the reasons why not a lot of machine learning models that have been trained and developed have been implemented in clinics as of yet, is that they're not always better, right? Often they can be, but the margins are kind of small, in terms of the improvement in performance. And that being coupled with the machine learning not being interpretable or trustable by clinicians, I think is the death rattle. That's the death note to a lot of these models being implemented in the clinic. Now, I think, when it comes, before I kind of I almost frowned upon ensemble learning, like going from a decision tree to random forest, because of the fact that it reduces interpretability. But at the same time, ensemble learning, can get much better performance, right? The same way if you took a panel of clinicians and had them make a collective voted diagnosis on a patient, you'd expect them to, make better decisions as a team rather than just a single clinician on their own. Same thing is true, I think, with machines, but there's that trade-off with interpretability. Did that begin to answer your question at least?
Well, it sort of answers the question, but I think going back to, sort of considering the question of interpretability is if you actually ask a consultant as to why he has made a particular decision, I mean, it's well known from lots of psychological experiments that the explanations that people give don't actually bear very much resemblance to the reason why they made the decision. And so it's, I mean, the thing is, a lot of criticism of AI models not being interpretable and being black boxes forget about the fact that in actual fact, if it had been a human being who'd been making the decision, you'd have exactly the same situation. So there isn't a nice kind of clean answer to it. So I was really just sort of wondering, what your feelings around those sorts of questions were. And it's, it's easy to kind of just sort of think, have I got a good algorithm? But to sort of compare it, well, whether my algorithm's good or not, how does it compare with, what am I comparing it with? Am I comparing it with other algorithms, or am I trying to compare it with the performance of a human being?
Right. Right. No, and I think that's an excellent point. And at the end of the day, right, it's easy to compare, predictive performance between humans and machines, right? But then how do you compare their explainability? I know, at least, so I've gotten my feet wet with expert systems and how difficult it can be to assemble a set of rules, right? Like going back and asking experts, how did they make the decision, and trying to translate that into an effective expert system. I'm just beginning to have an appreciation for how difficult that can be. Because, right, when we make decisions, we have all these, as you mentioned, like, sort of unconscious biases or information we're not even maybe, aware that we're utilizing. And so that can be really difficult. And I guess one of the plus sides to machines is, in theory, there should be less of that, right? So as long as you understand, so if you have a deep learning machine learning model, right, which is not interpretable, but maybe it's explainable, but you have a sense of how reliable those explanations are, right? You could get a sense of, how often you can actually rely on the explanations that are being made. While with a human, that might not be the case, right? It might be much more subjective to be like, well, is their explanation actually accurate or not? How do you even begin to capture that or quantify that is in itself a pretty challenging question. So I think you bring up a really important challenge in this area, just in general.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is getting more and more fascinating. But in the interest of time, I will ask if there is any other question from the audience, any other comment. Tianru, please go ahead.
Hi, it's very nice talk. Thank you. I want to ask, is that prime implicants that you are using in the tables?
Could you repeat the middle of that? That the what that I was using in the tables?
Yes, in the middle of the slides, you have tables, and the method you use to interpret it, is this prime implicant?
Prime, sorry, I'm struggling with that last word. Prime
implicants. Do you use knowledge compilation?
My apologies. I'm
Maybe you
sorry.
can.
The connection isn't quite stable, Keandro. Do you want to repeat your question, please, again, maybe?
Oh yeah, sorry. I mean, in some of your slides, when you're interpreting the models, you use tables.
Tables,
I mean,
okay.
the lines. Yeah. Are you using prime implicants and knowledge compilation?
So these tables?
Yeah, some pages before that.
These tables.
No, just not this page. Maybe somewhere before. Yeah, it's something like this. Yeah.
My apologies. I'm so sorry. I'm struggling to understand your question.
Yeah, maybe we take this
like
offline.
this.
Maybe if you're keen to.
Would you mind messaging me? I'm glad to give
Yeah.
make my email available, and I'm glad to talk about it offline.
Yeah, Christian is trying to
you.
help. He says the question is: are you using prime implicants and knowledge compilation in your tables?
I'm actually not sure what the former thing is. Maybe that's why I'm struggling with your question. Prime implicants? I'm not familiar with that. My apologies. But again, I'd be glad to talk about it. I'd like to learn more about your question. So please, I'm glad to talk via email. That'd be great.
Yeah, that's
Ryan's
exactly
email was.
asking.
Yeah, was at the last slide, Keandro. So he's happy for you to contact him and get to the bottom of that. Any other question, please? Any other question, comment? No. I will go back to a question in the chat. Oh, there is another hand up by Thomas. So Thomas, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
I wanted to ask about the limitation. So this evolutionary approach. So you may be getting a different set of rules each time you basically run the algorithm with different random seed, for example. So I was wondering what practical sort of problems or limitations are there for this particular rule learning approach?
Sure. I mean,
experience.
That's a great question. So that is typically noted as a downside to any evolutionary algorithm. The fact that they're not deterministic. If you don't use the same random seed, you'll get different results every time. And when I say different results, they're usually, in my experience, they're usually subtle differences. So the rule base isn't exactly the same. Maybe it found one extra feature here, one extra feature there to be included in a rule or not. So the differences are usually subtle. And so the way we tend to use these tools is for knowledge discovery. We're approaching these problems saying, hey, we have biomedical data. People have analyzed these with really basic techniques, but we're looking for complex patterns that allow us to make more predictive predictions, but also to better understand the underlying disease. So running these is not the end point, right? So we don't run it once and say, hey, this is the model we found, we're done. For us, it's really a starting point. It's about generating new hypotheses. It's now we've discovered evidence that there are these interactions. Now we're going to go back and use traditional statistical approaches compared to other machine learning approaches to sort of hone down the problem to say, well, what seem to be the key features that are important? How are those features associated with the outcome? In other words, are there complex patterns? Are there simple patterns? So we don't use a single run as the be all end all. And I think that's why, at least for us, it hasn't been such an issue that you can get slightly different results when you run these. The trade-off for us is that, by being open-ended and stochastic, you are making fewer assumptions about the problem space, and you typically have a better chance of finding more complex patterns if they're there, right? You could run this on a data set and you could have just as well run logistic regression and be done, but you wouldn't know that ahead of time, right? You have to, that's why comparing methodologies is also important. I definitely subscribe to the idea that, if you want to get into machine learning, if you're running machine learning, don't stick with your favorite algorithm, right? You got to branch off and try at least a small set of algorithms with that take different perspectives on the analysis and on the modeling. So that's one reason we had put together this pipeline, was to be able to more effectively compare the methods we were developing in rule-based machine learning to a broader spectrum of established machine learning standards.
Okay, thank you very much. I did not realize that being stochastic can even be an advantage if you are in this knowledge discovery.
It depends on the problem domain, but yes, yeah, I certainly would say that it can be an advantage as well. But you are absolutely right. It certainly be a disadvantage as well.
Okay, any other question, thought, comment? I know we are 20 minutes over time, and we're probably getting Ryan exhausted by now. But I think it is good to have the discussion. That's what we're all here for. So I've kept this going. So if you don't mind, Ryan, I'm asking for any other questions at the moment. Maybe the last one. I have a few, but I have, so to speak, easier access to you. So I leave to do those offline. It's a lot of stuff that I find very interesting here. Any other question or comment? Okay, I'll go on to Jakob's comment. So Jakob has posted on the chat a link to a challenge that the decision-making community, the DM community, who are the decision campers mostly, as I understand it, have posted on Kaggle. And he was asking, I guess it's not for now, but he was asking, what are your views on this challenge? Would LCS and LCS-based solution or rule-based machine learning solution work for this challenge? Or at least what your thoughts are on solutions that people have posted to that challenge. I don't know the challenge personally. There is a link there. I'm happy to pass it on. And perhaps
yeah, I love the link. I'll have to read up on myself. So yeah.
Yes, and you can actually send your comments to DM community. There are all the information in these links, and it's related to a famous CADL challenge from 2012 about booking rules for Titanic. So it's kind of funny challenge. Okay, thank you very much anyway, Ryan. It's very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice. Right, so yes, so if there's not many other comments, I've received also, Ryan, very quickly, a few requests for you to join us on one of the RuleML webinars that are held every last Wednesday of the month. So there is one coming up in September, which might be too close, but there is also one coming up in October and November and so on. So we will be happy to host you there and grill you some more on rule-based machine learning.
It'll be my pleasure.
Other than that, I will thank you again with a virtual clap, and thank you very much for accepting the invitation and for spending an hour and a half with us today.
Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Now, all the people, I think, will either go to dinner or lunch, I think, in the US, and then join DecisionCamp for the session to follow, Jakob, right?
That's correct, and you all guys have URL. If you need it, I just will post it right now here. Maybe
that might be useful, yes, if you could post it here. We have circulated it,
but
no, let me easier,
just,
yes.
I will post it. Let me find it just a second. I will do it. I will post here. Okay. Okay, before we leave. DecisionCamp. Okay, here is a link. So you can be starting at 2 o'clock Eastern time. So everybody welcome to join us. And thank you very much again. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you everyone for attending and for making this interesting discussion.
Thanks again.